Listen carefully, because the first sound you're about to hear didn't echo through the fields of Georgia in 1840. It echoes through you. A creak, a breath, a whisper behind a locked door. And if you feel that tightening in your chest right now, that instinctual sense that you're standing too close to something forbidden good, because the truth we're about to peel open was never meant for you, or for any man still capable of seeing the world clearly. In the heart of Middle Georgia, behind modest timber walls and a reputation so deliberately unremarkable it might as well have been camouflage, Moss Creek Plantation hid a power structure darker than the soil beneath it. Outsiders thought it was nothing small, efficient, forgettable. But men who walked its grounds carried something back with them. Tension, a question they never managed to articulate. A knowing. It clung to them like humidity and silence. They whispered about the owner, Eleanor Cresswell, only when they were sure they were alone. A widow at 31. No children. No interest in social rituals or the lace and teacup theater of Southern womanhood. Her neighbors called her strange, distant, unsettling. But those who saw her eyes up close understood something deeper. She wasn't detached. She was calculating, measuring, watching the world like a predator studying patterns. And those patterns always involved young men. Through ledgers, letters, and coded notations, some burned by authorities, others buried in attics or found behind walls, the truth began taking shape. Eleanor was buying men the way a scholar collects artifacts. Deliberately, strategically, and with a focus so unnerving that one Charleston broker would later confess he felt he had handled a serpent hidden under human skin. These men, strong, young, hand-picked, arrived at Moss Creek with hope or fear or resignation. But within weeks they left changed. Not broken, no, broken men don't fetch high profits. They left altered, carrying a silence that seemed too heavy for the human throat. A silence that didn't come from wounds you could see, but from something that reached inside them and rearranged the shape of their identity. If you're feeling it already, that creeping sense that the story isn't about history, but about power, lean in. Because this descent is just beginning. And what Eleanor Cresswell did inside that house wasn't driven by desire, but by dominance, leverage, and an agenda older than the plantation system itself. The deeper you move into the history of Moss Creek, the more you begin to understand that its horror wasn't born from spectacle, but from method. Eleanor Cresswell didn't rule through chaos. She ruled through systems, the kind designed to break a man without ever laying a visible mark on him. Every plantation in the South was built on dominance, but Moss Creek operated on a different wavelength entirely. It wasn't just a place of forced labor. It was a laboratory of psychological control. And Eleanor, quiet, unassuming, almost forgettable, was its architect. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The power she wielded came from precision, measuring every worker's movements, habits, resilience. She studied them like a strategist tracking enemy lines. Men quickly realized that nothing they did went unnoticed. A glance, a hesitation, a tremor in the voice. She recorded everything. And the isolation was the real weapon. Newly purchased men were kept apart, denied the comfort of community, the strength that comes from shared struggle. They weren't introduced to the routines of Moss Creek until they had passed through Eleanor's private evaluation period. That week alone in her control was where the reshaping began. She assessed discipline, endurance, emotional response, not with whips, but with silence, pressure, and the slow erosion of autonomy. By the time they were released into the fields, the others saw it instantly. The stiffness in their posture, the way their eyes avoided the main house like a physical threat, the quiet panic that flickered whenever Eleanor approached. There was no visible injury, only a heaviness in the soul, the kind that comes from understanding you belong to someone who sees you not as human, but as a component in a larger operation. And then came her preparation cycle. For 12 to 18 months, the men were worked not simply to exhaustion, but to specification. Diets adjusted, work assignments rotated, strength trained or tested based on her handwritten metrics. Some men were selected for specialized labor tasks that made them appear more valuable to outside buyers. Others were deliberately kept out of sight until she judged them fully ready. Buyers from Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. They thought they were purchasing prime labor. They didn't realize they were buying the end product of a conditioning process more sophisticated than any plantation around them. Because Eleanor wasn't selling men. She was selling control refined, packaged, perfected. And Moss Creek became profitable not through brutality, but through the cold science of breaking the will without breaking the body. Once you understand the machinery of Moss Creek, you begin to see why the neighboring planters couldn't make sense of Eleanor Cresswell. They thought power came from spectacle, from displays of punishment, from loud overseers, from public dominance. But Eleanor understood something older, something far more effective. Control is strongest when it's invisible. The men she sold didn't just fetch high prices because of muscle or labor skill. Experienced buyers in Alabama and Mississippi noted something else, something they couldn't quite quantify. These men followed orders instantly. They worked with a precision uncommon for newly purchased labor. They did not test boundaries. They did not resist. They did not show the early defiance that most trafficked men struggled with for months. They arrived already conditioned. That's what made Eleanor dangerous. She was designing obedience the same way merchants designed products. And yet the most unsettling detail wasn't in the men she sold. It was in the records she kept. Eleanor cataloged everything. Physical strength, temperament, stress response, patterns of fatigue, even how long it took each man to recover from emotional strain. She tracked these characteristics with a discipline more common to military intelligence than plantation management. And the third ledger, the one the broker found burned at the edges, revealed something darker. Codes, symbols, sequences that didn't match agricultural bookkeeping. If you've been paying attention, you already know what this means. Eleanor wasn't managing Moss Creek. She was running an experiment. But experiments attract attention. Even in 1840, that's when the disappearances began. Men who were sold but never arrived. Men whose names appeared in sales ledgers but not in shipping manifests. Buyers reported missing property. But no one accused Eleanor openly. Not because they trusted her, but because the authorities in Georgia were already quietly protecting her. Plantation families owed the Cresswells favors that stretched back decades. Shipping magnates, judges, legislators, men whose reputations depended on secrets staying buried. So when a man vanished, it wasn't a tragedy. It became paperwork. The first missing worker, Samuel, was dismissed as a transport accident. The second as theft. The third as administrative confusion. But the pattern grew unmistakable. The men who disappeared were always the ones who reacted to Eleanor's system differently. The ones who resisted her psychological conditioning. The ones who did not break. Those men were quietly erased. Not sold. Not stolen. Removed. Because to Eleanor Cresswell, an unbreakable man wasn't an asset. He was a threat to the entire operation. What happened to the men who couldn't be conditioned? That question haunted the slaves who lived in the cabins, the buyers who read the ledgers, and the few lawmen who dared glance too deeply into Moss Creek's records. But no one asked it aloud. Because at Moss Creek, questions were as dangerous as escape attempts. The truth surfaced slowly, fragments whispered between cabins, glimpses caught at the wrong moment, patterns too sharp to ignore. When a man resisted Eleanor's system, when he held onto himself with a force she could not bend, he didn't return to the fields. He didn't get sold. He simply vanished. And everyone knew where the vanishing trail led. The barn. It was too large for the plantation's size. Too sturdy. Built with reinforced beams and a loft that appeared to serve no purpose. No livestock were kept there. No tools. No cotton bundles. And yet, every so often, on nights when the wind died and the moon thinned to a sliver, a faint lantern glow flickered behind its shutters. The house slaves learned to avoid looking at it. One of them later described the feeling as, like the earth shaking even though the ground didn't move. Not noise, just a disturbance. Pressure. As if the barn itself held something alive behind its walls. Or something ending. By the late 1840s, rumors spread among locals that Eleanor had taken to conducting inspections of her workforce in the barn before sale. Buyers assumed it was a final health check. But the slaves knew better. The men who walked in were not the men who walked out. Some left quieter. Some left hollow. Some never left at all. And the county officials? They looked the other way, because everyone owed the Cresswells something. A business contract. Political debt.
A social alliance.
Eleanor didn't need to threaten anyone. Her power came from restraint, the kind of restraint that reminded powerful men how fragile their reputations were. Yet cracks in her system began forming. A house servant overheard Eleanor arguing with an anonymous visitor, someone from Savannah. Someone who claimed she was jeopardizing the lineage. Another day, 2 field workers reported seeing a crate hidden behind the barn, sealed and stamped for shipment but never loaded. When a storm rolled in and the crate broke open, the contents forced the men into silence for life. Not bones, not remains, clothes, belongings, objects from the missing objects Eleanor never intended to send anywhere. The conclusion became unavoidable. She wasn't disposing of unbreakable men. She was studying them, testing the limits of the human will, and documenting the results. By the 1850s, the men at Moss Creek understood something with a clarity that no one dared voice. Eleanor Cresswell was no longer running a plantation. She was building a model, a template for controlling human beings without chains, without scars, without rebellion. A system that didn't just extract labor, but rewired identity. And she was getting better at it. Her ledger entries became more abstract. Less about weight, age, productivity, more about patterns, reaction times, delays in speech, resilience under prolonged silence. She tracked how long a man could endure confinement, how quickly he adapted to structured routines, how efficiently he followed orders under stress. This wasn't management. This was behavioral engineering decades before the term existed. But Eleanor's most chilling evolution came in the way she manipulated belief. She understood that a man who thinks he has no future is easy to control. But a man who thinks he has a role, a purpose, even one imposed from above, is nearly impossible to revolt. So she created narratives. Small ones, subtle ones. She assigned certain men responsibilities, trivial tasks that made them feel chosen while isolating those who showed independence. She orchestrated rivalries. She shifted alliances. She decided who felt hope and who felt despair. Every emotion at Moss Creek came from her hand. And the men who resisted, they were identified early, marked, and eventually removed. What terrified the surviving workers wasn't what happened to the missing, it was how predictably Eleanor could predict them. She anticipated reactions before they happened. She controlled conversations without being present. She could sense loyalty fading and fear rising like she was reading a map. Then, in 1853, something changed. A shipment ledger from Savannah listed a delivery of scientific instruments to Moss Creek optical devices, measuring implements, precision tools normally used in maritime navigation or medical examination. Eleanor claimed they were for surveying land. But no surveyors ever visited, and no new fields were marked. Instead, the instruments disappeared into the barn. That same year, 3 men vanished within a single season. All 3 had reputations for strength, not physical strength, but internal strength. Men who endured hardship without folding. Men who looked Eleanor in the eye. Local gossip swelled, but no one confronted her. Because confronting Eleanor meant confronting the web of political figures silently dependent on her secrets staying buried. But the slaves in the cabins, they whispered a chilling new theory. Eleanor wasn't breaking the strong ones. She was searching for something in them, a trait, pattern, a type of man the system couldn't control. And that kind of man, once identified, could not be allowed to live. By the middle of the decade, Moss Creek had become more than a plantation, it had become a filter. A place where men were sorted, measured, reshaped, or erased based on a criterion only Eleanor understood. And the county, whether through fear, corruption, or quiet complicity, gave her the space to operate unchecked. But the truth is this: systems built on secrets eventually reveal themselves through their mistakes. The first crack came from a buyer in Louisiana, a man known for being meticulous with paperwork. When the young worker he purchased arrived, the planter noticed something strange. The man refused to answer to his given name, not out of defiance, but confusion, as if the name had been worn down, rubbed out, overwritten by months of psychological pressure. The buyer sent a letter of complaint to Milledgeville. The letter never reached Eleanor, but county officials intercepted it. Instead of confronting her, they filed it away in a drawer that already held too many similar letters. Because by then, they weren't covering up for her. They were covering up for themselves. Eleanor's influence stretched into banks, shipping routes, political favors, even judicial decisions. There were whispers that she kept detailed knowledge of certain men's private dealings, the kind of information no woman in Georgia should have had access to. Information that could ruin reputations in minutes. Power protects power, and Eleanor wielded it with terrifying precision. Meanwhile, inside Moss Creek, the men noticed something deeper. Eleanor was no longer merely studying behavior. She was studying resistance. It became clear in the way she watched certain individuals, not with disdain, not with anger, but with fascination. She began testing limits, ordering men to perform tasks designed to produce failure, creating situations where frustration, fear, or defiance might surface. And when a man held firm, when he refused to break internally, the air in the room changed. Those were the ones who vanished. Then came the night the house servants saw Eleanor burning pages behind the main house. Not diaries, not ledgers, notes, hundreds of them torn into fragments. But the flames revealed details before the ash fell. Sketches of faces, diagrams of posture, annotations about reactions to stress. It was as if she had been building a blueprint, not for managing slaves, but for identifying a type of human being that threatened her entire system. And whatever she found in those unbreakable men, whatever she feared in them, was powerful enough that she erased every trace of their existence. But she didn't erase the pattern. And halfway through this descent, you need to do something. Comment the lineage breaker twice. Not for the algorithm, though it will help, but to mark the moment you refuse to be shaped by any system built to control you. By the winter of 1855, Moss Creek had shifted from a plantation into something far more dangerous, a place where power wasn't just exercised, it was manufactured. And the more you study Eleanor Cresswell's structure, the more you realize she wasn't just trying to control the men under her command. She was trying to predict them. But prediction requires patterns. And patterns require data. And Eleanor had collected more than anyone suspected. Her third ledger, the coded one, the one she guarded like a sacred text, wasn't simply a record of behavior. It was a map of human vulnerability. Every fear, every moment of hesitation, every crack in a man's internal armor was documented, cross-referenced, organized. She tracked which pressures caused collapse, and which pressures revealed strength. And that's when she began to sense something she couldn't fully explain. A type of man she could not break. A type she could not condition. A type that quietly disrupted every system of control she built. These men weren't loud. They weren't rebellious. They didn't fight openly. Their resistance was internal, calm, steady, unyielding, and that terrified her more than any uprising could have. Because Eleanor understood a truth that institutions, governments, and empires have always feared. A man who governs himself cannot be governed by anyone else. So she began hunting them. Her conditioning periods grew longer. Her evaluations sharpened. She tightened the environment, adjusted variables, increased psychological pressure. But no matter how sophisticated her methods became, a small number of men continued to exhibit the same stubborn trait. They retained themselves, not their name, not their role, themselves. And that meant they were outliers in her system, proof that her method wasn't perfect. Proof that her engineered obedience had limits. Proof that human will carried a dimension she couldn't quantify. In the cabins, the whispers grew darker. The missing weren't random. They weren't mistakes. They weren't logistical errors. They were selected. Selected because they represented something the system couldn't afford to acknowledge. Men with internal authority, men who couldn't be rewritten. And then came the final signal that something catastrophic was brewing. A series of deliveries from Savannah, crates marked as medical supplies, preservation materials, and anatomical instruments. Items no plantation in Georgia needed. Items used not for work, but for study. The barn wasn't just a place of disappearance. It was a research chamber, and Eleanor had shifted from controlling men to dissecting the very nature of resistance itself. You feel it before you see it, this low, bone-deep vibration, like the earth is remembering something it swore to forget. The air turns heavier, not with fear, but with the weight of truth that was buried too precisely, too deliberately, as if someone knew one day you'd end up here, standing in the exact spot where the lie finally loses its grip. Every story you've heard tonight, every whisper, every omen, every forbidden detail, you thought they were fragments. But they weren't. They were breadcrumbs leading you back to the one place no one leaves unchanged. The threshold between what actually happened and what the world was told happened. And now you're standing in that doorway, realizing that the final secret isn't hidden in the past at all. It's right here, watching you notice it. Look closely. The faces in the portraits aren't expressions frozen in time, they're warnings. The creak in the hallway isn't settling wood, it's the last residue of someone silenced before they could speak. The land beneath your feet doesn't just hold history, it digests it, breaks it down, and waits for the next soul brave or foolish enough to ask the question everyone else avoided. Why did they try so hard to erase this? Why did they bury it so deep it took centuries for the ground to spit it back up? And the more you stare into the darkness, the more you understand the truth no historian dares to put in ink. This place was never abandoned. It was retired. Retired because whatever lived here didn't die. It adapted. And you came here thinking you were a witness. You thought uncovering the truth would keep you safe, that revelation would act like some kind of shield. But the past doesn't reward curiosity. It punishes exposure. The walls around you weren't just built to protect the secret, they were built to test who deserved to leave with it. And now you feel it, this subtle shift in the air, like breath brushing your neck, like fingers tracing the outline of your spine. Something that knows you've seen too much. Something that has been waiting for this exact moment, when revelation turns into consequence. So listen carefully. You didn't stumble into this story. You were summoned by it. The question now isn't what happened here. The question is what it wants from you and whether the truth you just uncovered is the last story you'll ever tell. If the story left you uncomfortable in ways you can't explain, that's how you know it's real. Comment what moment hit you hardest. Your answer adds another page to this forbidden record. Share this with one person who won't sleep tonight.